Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein. I am the president of the Art Society, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to Preserving New York Theaters. Back in January, which feels like a decade ago, we had envisioned this program really focused much more on the bricks and mortar aspects of theaters and their importance to the culture and economy of New York City. With our country and our city dealing with the dual impacts of COVID-19 and also the racial inequities and ensuing protests all across the nation for Black Lives Matter, this conversation has really truly pivoted. It's our intention now to focus on the preservation of theaters in the direst and deepest sense. When and how will theaters reopen and not only reopen but thrive while they do? How can theaters and the arts actually serve a role in healing the issues that our society confronts, as well as the industry itself? These are questions that we'll dive into with our panelists very shortly, and I will introduce them in just a second, but I want to take a couple minutes here just to explain the platform that you're on and give you some notes that will help you navigate Demio. In the chat box to the right, you can comment and ask questions, and I will incorporate the questions that you ask into the panel discussion as time allows and as it is consistent with the other topics that we're covering. So please feel free to put your questions there. We'll also add some tips in the chat for your reference. They're at the bottom of the screen at the moment, but they'll end up in chat very shortly. Throughout the program, you'll see buttons will appear on your screen, which will give you additional information about some of the topics and resources that we're talking about today. These links, if you click on them, will open in another browser window. So even after you've closed down this program, after we're done, you will be able to access those links on your browser. Please remember to come back if you take a look at them. You can also adjust your view, such as expanding to a full screen or by collapsing the chat box if you prefer, by using the arrow tools right next to the chat box on the top of the page. Our program today is anticipated to run about an hour, and it is being recorded, and a recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after the program is over. Now, I'd really like to kick off our program, and feel free to say hello to each other while we're doing this, and let us know where you're joining us from. We've discovered people are joining us from near and far, and we'd love to know that. Or feel free to let us know which performing arts spaces, theaters you're missing the most at this time. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce and honor our incredible speakers today. The first speaker and respondents will be in conversation is Dr. Indira Etwaroo, and she is an award-winning producer, director, scholar, author, and nonprofit arts leader. She is the executive artistic director for Billie Holiday Theatre, a beacon for world-class arts rooted in racial justice in the heart of Bed-Stuy, and has also worked with cultural institutions such as BAM and the Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, which is actually the very first community development organization in the nation. Dr. Etwaroo has spent decades focused on the complex intersections between community, performing arts, and the topics of our time, leading towards models of institutional thrivability in the 21st century. Please welcome Indira.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Our second speaker today is Kathleen Hughes. She is the first Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the largest local funder of arts and culture in the United States. Most recently, she was serving as the acting commissioner for the agency, and prior to that, she was the assistant commissioner overseeing the agency's program services unit, which currently supports almost 1,000 organizations, arts and cultural organizations throughout the 5 boroughs, including MAS and Restoration Arts, which is part of the Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation. Thank you both for joining us today. We're really excited about this conversation. And I thought maybe we'd start off sort of thinking, if we can, back to pre-COVID. And I'd love you both to talk a little bit about the importance of performing arts and theater in particular to New York City, culturally and also economically. Who would like to start us off?
Well, I'll jump in. You know, I am a presenter. I am a producer of arts and culture in New York City, an institutional leader, but I'm also the mother of an emerging artist. So watching community members respond to local and regional institutions and institutions that bring people from all over the world, such as our Broadway theaters. And, you know, they are the lifeline of a city like New York City. They are the very DNA and economic driver of all that we hold very dear in New York City. So when you have converging pandemics like COVID-19 and the pandemics that are illuminating even more greatly the racial injustices in our country, the lifeline of the city will be greatly impacted. And I don't think there's a New Yorker who hasn't felt the residual effects of our field being impacted by this historic moment.
No, I think that's right. Kathy, this must be a huge challenge for you and your organization, given how intricate you are connected to the arts and performance world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. We fund both the performing and the non-performing disciplines, as well as the humanities. But theater is our single largest discipline that receives an astonishing level of support. And when you said think back, just put your mind back just a few months ago, things couldn't have been rosier in one sense, certainly in the economic sense. And after the middle of March, the economic driver for the city suffered an unbelievable blow. And that's, I think, pervasive. As Indira pointed out, it's at the local level, it's communities where they rely on the local theater for training their children or for the entertainment that they can get by going to the theater, or whether it's on the more international level with people coming here to see something on Broadway and staying and spending money. And none of that is happening. And it looks like none of it, let me qualify that, not none of it, but a lot of it isn't going to happen for a long time. I think what is amazing about working in the cultural field with cultural workers is you realize how unbelievably creative they are and how capable they are of making things happen, even when in your wildest dreams you wouldn't have thought that could be true. And I think Indira has pointed out this sort of amazing moment we are in, where COVID and Black Lives Matter have come together in a way that I think has the potential to be transformative, and in fact, better be transformative.
Absolutely. Indira, can you talk to us a little bit about the Billie Holiday Theatre and how it came into being and its relationship to the local community?
Absolutely. The Billie Holiday Theatre was founded in 1972 by the first community development corporation in the nation, Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, which was founded in 1967. It's a corporation, again, the first in the country of its kind, that emerged as the solution to race riots that were happening in the late 1960s, specifically 1966. And so community members invited Robert F. Kennedy, who came to Bedford Stuyvesant, and Jacob Javits at the time, bipartisan senators. They came together with community members, and they formed what has been the first community development corporation in the nation, Restoration. The first president, Franklin A. Thomas, who went on to become the first African American president at the Ford Foundation, he understood that one could not redevelop and transform a community without arts and culture. And so the Billie Holiday Theater is, again, an answer to a really challenging historic moment in our country's history. It has been on the front lines of racial justice like most Black theaters across the country. It has survived many, many economic storms, many sociocultural storms, but we are at a moment, again, like a lot of institutions of color across the country, a particularly vulnerable moment because the brown and Black communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and we are funded at a different level. There is an inequity that still remains in terms of how institutions of color are funded. And so the Billie Holiday Theater is yet one example of Black-led and brown-led institutions across the country, Elizabeth, that are really taking a look at what the converging pandemics mean to our community. Our community, they are made up of some of the brightest and most creative and dynamic human beings I've ever had the privilege to call audience. They're very vocal. They care very deeply about the Billie Holiday Theater as a world-class institution in their own communities. They love that the theater is, you know, a couple of blocks away where they can walk with their parents to come and enjoy great theater. So it's important to our community that the Billie Holiday Theater is able to remain a vibrant part. And I know that's a story for other cultural institutions across New York City and across the country.
Well, maybe we can just talk a little bit. You've touched on this a little bit, Indira, but maybe we could get a little bit deeper in sort of understanding what these dual crises have really exposed in some of the both the inequities, but also in the fundamental fault lines in the industry itself. And so I wonder whoever would like to take that first. I'm interested in hearing your comments.
Yeah, I'll just continue my thought, and then I'd love to share the space with Kathy, who I know has the most critical citywide view. But from my view, what we've seen is a lot of data that's emerged in the last couple of years. And what we know is that there's about $2.3 billion that's given to arts and cultural institutions in the United States for arts and culture, as arts and culture funding. And out of that 2.3 billion, roughly 60% of that goes to the top two institutions. And the top two of those institutions are larger in scale. They're also presenting Eurocentric art. They're serving a mainly predominantly white audience, and the leadership is predominantly white. 10% of that funding goes to brown and Black institutions. And if those institutions are focused on social justice, it drops to 4%. And so, you know, the city plan that's been taking place, New York City, Tom Finkelpearl just, you know, he outlined a new plan for the city, a cultural plan, and that was to offset some of the historic discrepancies that were happening in city and state funding. We know that, you know, I worked at BAM for many, many years, and now I'm in their neighboring district in Bedford Stuyvesant. And the Brooklyn Community Foundation shed light on the fact that state and city arts funding per resident, it's $48 for Fort Greene. And when it moves to Bedford Stuyvesant, it drops to $2.44 per a 2015 study. Again, we can see the huge discrepancy in that funding, and that's per resident. I do want to note, for the sake of objectivity, is that Fort Greene is an arts district, but it doesn't necessarily explain away a $46 per resident discrepancy. So I think the New York City Cultural Plan is a great move in the right direction, and one that I'm very heartened by and was glad to be included. Like many artistic leaders across the country, it was such an inclusive process to begin to figure out how we can level that playing field in terms of funding.
Kathy, you must have deep thoughts about this as well.
I think Indira's last statement was right. It's a beginning. We're beginning to try to level the playing field. We're not going to get there quickly. Government doesn't move quickly. And I certainly can't be accountable for the city and the state, but I am somewhat accountable for the city. And while, I'm proud to say we've supported the Billie since '82, I think that's when I first got to know it. So my guess is that's about right. The level of support at many organizations is not what it ought to be. And it's a very complicated approach that uses a bunch for us of different sources. The city council is a source of funding for us. The city budget is a source of funding for us. And the damage that COVID is wreaking at the moment on the budget is unprecedented. And that's where it bothers me. The new commissioner, who just started 6 weeks ago, is committed to equity and to healing. Elizabeth, I picked up on your healing comment from the very beginning, because in fact, that is something that arts does. But it's got to do that in every community, and it's got to do that in an equitable way. It can't be just about putting things back where they were and expecting that everything will be fine. So that's going to have to be investigated, looked at in depth, and the resources to do that, I don't know where they're going to come from. The city is at the moment unable to borrow funds. The city at the moment has not gotten federal funding. And the city at the moment is spending enormous amounts of money on health issues. But the change I've seen in the field over the past at least 10 years that has to do with the role social justice plays in people's dialogue and the role that being civic citizens has played is heartening to me. It's not enough. I don't know when it would ever be enough. Probably, certainly not in my tenure, and maybe not in my lifetime. But at some point, that balance has to be looked at and rectified. And I think that's just what Indira is suggesting.
Well, so,
And I want to, if I may, Elizabeth, I want to just piggyback off of what Kathy said, because I think that really, what Kathy said really is at the heart of this moment. I think when we look back as a field, when we look back as a nation and a city, we're all faced with what could have been done differently. How could we have built structures differently? What I'm heartened by, even as my team thinks about the Billie Holiday Theatre and what we might have done differently, how we as an institution serving the largest community of African Americans in the nation, what we might have done differently in our almost 50-year tenure of serving that community and taking a hard look inward to ourselves, is that we have this majestic opportunity to see the world anew. And if we can't have all of the economic support, certainly we can rally the moral and the philosophical and the ideological support to figure out ways that we can begin to think about the blueprint that is arts and culture in New York City, that is arts and culture in the country, that is arts and culture in the world. And we can begin to imagine a world where all people can flourish. I often think that economic challenge provides space and the runway to be thoughtful. That if you have the money to spend, you generally tend to spend it, and you think quickly, and you're not always as thoughtful. But economic challenge, if we're going to look at an optimistic side of that, it provides space for people to come together who are subject matter experts, who bring extraordinary passion to a field, to think in a deeper, thoughtful, more long-term way. Because what's most exciting for me at this moment, if there's any excitement or if there's any silver lining in this moment, and there must be, is that there's no field more poised to be experimental, as Kathy said, creative, tenacious than the arts and culture field. It's in the very DNA of who we are.
That's exactly right. Can I make one comment? Just because I'm afraid the moment will go by and we'll lose it.
Absolutely.
I think there's something that's I would call required reading. And it's a piece that Indira wrote called On Racial Justice. It was in the Brooklyn Reader. I'm sure MAS would be happy to make it available to everybody. But Indira, it was astonishing to me when I read that piece. Thank you for having written it and shared it.
Thank you, Kathy.
We have a number of folks who are talking of asking questions about the need in the commercial theater realm, which of course also I think is effective also in the nonprofit world, but about the relationship of funding to the need of the moment. That this, there's obviously been many theaters lost in the last decade and longer than that, just in circumstances of great prosperity, relatively speaking, in New York City. And yet, not only is this crisis creating a devastating circumstance for theaters across the city, both commercial and nonprofits, but we also are not necessarily seeing the federal government stepping up either systemically over time. Many other governments support the arts at the federal level in a much deeper way than we do in the United States. But there are some big packages that are happening at the federal level. And so far, there doesn't seem to be any deep funding coming really to the arts. And I'm curious whether either of you could comment on that, or whether there are conversations going on that I've missed.
It's been asked for.
Well, that's good to know.
I mean, I have the National Endowment. It was early March or mid-March, I think, when they stepped up and said, we have $50 million that we're going to add across the country. It was something, but I think that the federal government, expecting much right now from the federal government is probably not where we should put our energy. We have asked for money. The city desperately needs money. The arts desperately need money, but it's not going to be what people are going to think of.
I want to talk a little bit about the sort of spillover effect of the theaters into the gig economy in a much bigger way, because it's not just people who work in theaters who have been affected by this, but all of the associated trades. And I wondered if either of you can speak a little bit to that, about the impacts that you're seeing, either in association with Billie Holiday or more broadly across the city, as it affects it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a time where, we pushed pause on a show. We were up in our third week of rehearsals. There is a set sitting on the stage on a turntable with costumes hung, props all sitting on standby, and equity actors ready to go, scenic, just everything. We had to push pause. And what we tried to do, like many theaters across the country, is migrate readings and plays to online. We've also tried to be creative in terms of, migrating skill sets to other skill sets to ensure that we could keep people employed. We figured out ways how to, we have a project going on now on Fulton Street in response to the protest of Black Lives Matter mural, and it is allowing us to bring together in a safe social distancing way, our scenic painters, our behind the scenes folks to work on a project that would be atypical in a normal time. And I don't know if during a normal season we could have been able to do a 565-foot mural on the street. But so I think that what I'm seeing from theaters across the country, I'm actually quite heartened by the way theaters have turned on a dime and been able to present content online. So actors are still being hired. And I would encourage theaters that, if there are, what we've done at the Billy is migrate, subject matter expertise to other roles that may be able to take on different projects. That's been a way that we've been able to keep some of our independent contractors employed. And yet even still with, in full transparency, we're managing towards a bottom line that was challenged because of COVID-19. And so, we are doing as much as we can, but in full transparency, I'm sure I'm joined by theaters across New York City. There is only so much that we can do, even within the creative force of the industry.
Yeah, someone is asking about small theaters and the pressure to pay rent and the implications of that. And I was interested, Kathy, in turning to you a little bit to talk about some of the resources that you have been able to put in place and what you hope might follow to talk about to some of these problems.
Frankly, we're trying to get the money out the door that we had in this year's budget, and we're not sure yet what next year's budget is going to look like. And I think that's one of the real challenges, because the city's responsibilities are so all-encompassing at this time of COVID in terms of healthcare and basic city services that still need to be provided, and now are escalated because of the city hospital situation and because of the workers that have to be helping in that regard. But I think that it's, we have heard about organizations that are having difficulty with rent. I know there are conversations going on. I know that some organizations have renegotiated, but if theater can't come back for months, landlords aren't gonna, it becomes this house of cards that where one thing affects another, affects another, affects another. And I think, Elizabeth, the earlier part of your question certainly made me think about the fact that there are very, 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 very few people working in the theater who earn their livelihood by working in the theater and being theater artists. They cobble it together. They are absolutely a part of the gig economy. Well, maybe they'll get rehired by a restaurant next week, sort of, to serve something on a sidewalk. But it's amazing, the interdependency in this theater, in this city, and the degree to which the arts are at the core of that interdependency. When you think about if you want to be an actor and you have taken classes and you want to rehearse for something, or you want to audition for something, then the nighttime job is the way you're going to go to earn your living until you do get cast in something and get able to be paid. So Indira was on the very verge of bringing those people onto the stage, and they were going to earn a decent wage because equity makes sure of that. That's, multiply that times theater after theater after theater after theater, and designer and costumer and the people who run the sandwich shop around the corner where you go to get the coffee at rehearsal. It's a very complex interdependency that usually helps us a lot. But at this moment, because this is such a unique and challenging time, is making it worse.
Yeah. So theaters obviously play a really important role in getting new ideas out. We've been talking a lot about the creativity of the arts world, but it's also a place where new ideas, challenging ideas that challenge the status quo, are often first promulgated. And I'm curious whether either of you have given thought to what the physical life of a theater, when we can gather again socially distanced, what that can look like. I've seen some pretty devastating pictures of theaters in other countries where they've like yanked out all, every other seat, and it's hard to imagine as a New Yorker, much as I'm dying to get back and see great theater, it's hard to imagine when we're going to be able to get back into those settings. So I'm interested not only about whether you've thought of what the physical implications are for the space, but also what the implications are for arts outdoors and in unusual venues, or venues that may become the mainstay, I guess, if our physical places are not safe enough for us to gather in again.
They may for a while. And I just want to mention that the last theater piece I saw, and some people might not describe it as a theater piece, but I certainly would, was Harlem Stage's incomparable performance at the Temple of Dendur. And yes, I was sitting right next to people and right behind people. But Carl Hancock's Ruxin and Nona Hendricks did this amazing theater piece. And that's just partly the direction things can go in. I mean, you can see theater at the Park Avenue Armory that's unlike theater at the Roundabout in a fixed seat. We certainly are looking at outdoor things for the summer, and hopefully being able to bring back some things that might not have, that have been working out of doors, but also to potentially think in novel ways about things that maybe wouldn't have been out of doors. I think it's that, and as Indira said earlier, there's that opportunity side to the challenge, both the economic challenge and the social challenge. And I think we want to think creatively and help the theater community and the arts community do that. There are lots of novel ways of doing work. And I know there are concerns as well about being able to socially distance, being in a room with other people. Some traditional audiences have a traditionally older population, and there are concerns there that population may just not come back. I think that one of the most important things we can be doing is concentrating on younger populations and getting people involved in theater, because theater is something that speaks to them. In order for that to happen, it has to speak to them.
We seem to have temporarily lost Indira, I hope just temporarily. But I wanted to ask a question, and I think this is mostly directed to you, Kathy, so hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us here. And that is about the dynamics around sort of the small theaters that are working with small landlords, often very vulnerable landlords themselves, versus bigger developers who are, often in a situation where they're not as sympathetic to the dynamics of a more volatile business. We know in the land use world that a lot of developers need certified commercial leases, which means that they're looking at drugstores and banks and other people like that who can do this. That is not very helpful for small theaters who are by definition small businesses. And so I'm curious whether you have a sense of whether the city has thought about those dynamics and whether there are things that might be done to help mitigate some of those challenges. Welcome back, Indira.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
I think there need to be further, it's not my agency's area of expertise, right? So we need to partner with other areas within government, but we report to the Deputy Mayor for Economic Development. And so those conversations will happen. I have found in the very few handfuls of examples that I'm aware of, the smaller landlords are more hand to mouth themselves as a business. The larger landlords sometimes have the ability to say, well, all right, I'll look the other way for the next 6 months and we'll work something out because they can afford to. I think there's you're not going to find here the person who thinks that every theater should own their own space. I've been a strong proponent of the work happening creatively and then finding a place to occupy in order to present to an audience. So what's going to happen at a place like Signature, where there are many organizations that are going in and because of the facility there are able to present their work to an audience. It's different than, and it's very different than Bed-Stuy because thank God for Franklin Thomas, right? He knew back then. Same is true with Henry Street Settlement, even years before that, saying the arts need to be rooted in a community just as healthcare needs to be rooted in a community, just as social service needs to be rooted in a community. And now those things are coming together. But the rent situation is potentially devastating. It's all part of that sort of house of cards.
I was hoping you'd respond.
Yeah, I want to just echo that I absolutely agree with everything that Kathy said that I heard, which was the latter part. But this notion that healthy and thriving institutions need bricks and mortar to be healthy and thriving, I think is a really unhealthy paradigm, one that I think the more we can evangelize a shifting from that, the better. So the owning of bricks and mortar does not define a healthy and thriving institution that can be impactful to their community. When I came on board 5 years ago to Restoration, it owns over 333,000 square feet of space. And so what we began to do is figure out what other community groups needed space. We don't need all of this space. We're not using it. We have downtimes. How can we share this space? And so we launched what was an artistic coalition. And now it's not just the Billie Holiday Theatre on site. It's the Frank Silveira Writers Workshop that's been an Obie Award-winning workshop that was started by Morgan Freeman and Garland Lee Thompson Sr. They do all of their readings and we're their headquarters now. Evidence, Ronald K. Brown Evidence. They build their works and use the dance studios at the site and in partnership with the Billie Holiday Theatre. Kumbe, the Center for African and Diaspora Dance, they teach all of their classes on site. So we have a thriving ecosystem of institutions who share a mission, share some audience members, but we don't step on each other's toes in terms of our constituents and in terms of our, our core mission. And it is making a moment like this so much more tolerable. Not only do we have daily to weekly calls with one another where we're sharing resources, we have a trust built in. We're not reaching out to one another at a time of crises. It's like reaching out to family. We know we're going to be there for one another. So I would encourage this moment to really sort of herald what Kathy is saying, which is that bricks and mortar are not a definitive barometer for a healthy and thriving institution, nor a healthy and thriving community. I think the Billie Holiday Theatre, the moment it began to open its door, it was to other cultural institutions, all boats began to rise, including the boat that is the Billie Holiday Theatre, and our financial and economic structure began to have shared alliances internally, and we were able to have shared marketing, and shared space, and that again has created a much more healthy ecosystem for us.
Indira, I want to ask you to speak a little bit, if you might, on a slightly larger scale, because I know you're sitting on the mayor's, one of the mayor's COVID task forces that's focused on theaters and other performance art. And I'm just curious whether you can share a little bit about the kinds of conversations that are going on there.
Sure. What I'll start with, and I shared that space with Kathy, who so I want to just, thank her for inviting me into that space. And I will say, if people are curious, is one of the most, if not the most, diverse set of points of view of a task force that I've been on. So I think in terms of the diversity of boroughs and communities and points of view, it's really quite rich. But what we've been really tackling is how we're going to pull this off. And the heartening thing is it's not if, but it's when. Not one expert on that task force is questioning whether arts and culture will come back. We will come back. It is when we will come back, how we will come back, and lots of innovation continues to pass from leader to leader. We are really learning from each other in terms of best practices, everything from disinfecting stations to what it means to reopen a theater. And I do want to manage expectations for our New York City audiences and beyond. The idea of having people sit every other seat and only filling 50% of the theater, it's not an economically viable model for most theaters. So it's really important that people understand that we can't just put the same level of art up in the space and invite half the audience who social distances and it'll all work out. It's not going to work that way. And so to Kathy's point again, as she talked about the Nona Hendricks and Carl Hancock Rux piece, that's the kind of theater that now has the potential to sort of be a beacon and a guidepost and a marker for all of us as we start to think about what we can and how we can do it. I do want to say out loud as an example and a model that Restoration has lots of plaza space in Brooklyn. And we would be honored to open that plaza space up to people who have an idea. If they have an idea and they have some resources to pull it off, we can figure out with them how to make that space available to communities safe and an open way. Every institution doesn't have that, but we do have that. And I think the more we figure out how to share resources at this moment, the better we're all going to be.
I'm just going to cite another example from a while back, if I may, Elizabeth, that I thought of as you were speaking, Indira, which is a small theater company called Brave New World in Brooklyn that did a version of To Kill a Mockingbird long before the Broadway version of To Kill a Mockingbird on porches in Brooklyn. And the audience moved throughout that. It was incredibly novel. They did something at the beach at Coney Island that I saw, a version of The Tempest. And there, it's an incredibly inventive,
beautiful
feel. And so, there's no doubt in my mind that somehow Classical Theater of Harlem and Ty Jones is going to come up with something to do in the park as soon as they can do it. Because they have to be creative. That's their, thing. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's at least going to allow some of us to see live theater again, maybe, which is just all that I want right now, to be honest.
I guess I want to talk to both of you about, the city obviously is taking a big shock, Kathy, as you indicated, to its bottom line. And, I think we're all trying to figure out how the implications of this crisis play out. And I guess I'm curious about whether in the mayor's panel and, from both of your perspective, whether there's been conversations about how to take what is unfortunately probably going to be more limited resources and to think about making sure that they're not just distributed in the same old way across institutions, especially because right now, obviously, we all feel strongly that we need to be hearing voices that that haven't been heard as loudly as they might have been. So I'm curious whether there's been conversations about how that happens, and even if I know it's early in the process and you're not done with your deliberations, but I'm curious about how you're approaching the problem.
Daily conversations.
Yeah. Is there a sense that that there, I know the city budget is just around the corner here, whether we know what will truly be in it or not. Obviously in terms of tax dollars, that's going to be an ever-changing situation. But I do think from many of our perspectives, we're all looking to the mayor's task force and to department heads to really do this right for us, because it's so important going forward, obviously. I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming out that are obviously have come because we've started to talk about how does theater begin to happen in unusual places, whether it's on the street or in other public spaces that might be less traditional. And I'm curious whether you could both elaborate on what some of the places you might think about, whether you've been in conversations with performers and companies that are thinking about this kind of innovation, just to give us a hope of what socially distanced outdoor theater might be like, or in public space in the coming months.
Yeah, I tend to like to not be too prescriptive around these sort of things, because the artists always have the better idea. And it's and then you put two or more in a room and there's an even better idea. Three, I mean, it just sort of multiplies. So I will say, Elizabeth, is I have, since COVID happened, I get at least one or two calls, Facebook messages, and emails or text messages from an artist who has an idea. And I love that. That's been sort of the most beautiful part of this moment, is artists never stop having ideas. And so when I start hearing one idea over and over, then we start as a production team figuring out, how do we make this happen? So I think just keep opening the space up for artists to have ideas, because we may be a task force of 20 some people, but this is a city of thousands, hundreds of thousands of artists. So there are hundreds of thousands of artists, meaning ideas, to help lead us to a new world, a world in which all people can flourish, and a world in which we can build an even more powerful and transformative field that is arts and culture. So I do think, yes, we are one task force, but there are ways for us to make sure that the artists stay at the center of this conversation, and that the voices of artists lead us out of this moment. I do think that they have answers that we've not even thought of yet.
I'm sure that's the case. It's a fabulously inspiring idea. I'm curious whether, as theaters and performance venues really switched their venues from online to online in amazing ways, often using things that they had taped in the past. And one of our participants has sort of asked, do you think that there's going to be a movement imagining that there might be, unfortunately, reoccurrences of COVID as we go forward over the next couple of years, sort of more proactive thinking about preservation of programs so that they can be shared virtually, or maybe even just because we've all learned to live as artists and individuals and organizations in this virtual world, art forms that begin to develop out of this virtual world. That's happened to some extent already, but I'm just curious whether you think there'll be a longer term tail to this.
Yes. And I think one of the shortest words in the English language, or, is one of the most dangerous. I don't think theaters should have to feel like they're going to have to choose. I think right now we've had to rely on the online, and theaters are getting better at it and innovating and experimenting with these lots of different platforms. But I think it's I'm thinking back to the work I did at the Greene space, which was built to be multi-platform, and content would live on air, online, and on the street, on the stage. And I think that's where a lot of theaters have been and will continue to. And now some theaters who hadn't are now, sort of being pushed a little bit into that digital space. And I think we're finding that we don't ever want to leave it. Yes, we're going to keep always doing theater on the stage when we can, but we have really fallen in love with the idea of bringing stories to the digital space as well. So for us, it will be an and proposition. And I'm watching theaters across the country do the same thing. I had the privilege of working with Kenny Leon as associate director for Much Ado About Nothing, and WNET recorded it for television. And so it had the ephemeral experience of being in the Delacorte, and because it was recorded, it's now been able to be rebroadcast time and time again in this moment. So I do think that the and proposition for stories is really a powerful and exciting one, and it introduces new audiences to theater who might not think theater is for them. So again, I think for us at the Billie, we now have audiences who are tapping into content from across the world and the nation, and we have record numbers that we could never fit into our theater.
I think that's a really good point. The fact that it's opened things up to audiences that wouldn't be able to be there, or, just that isn't how it would work. But I also think that theater probably, because it has always been so rooted in the live experience, is a little behind the curve compared to some other disciplines that have moved in that direction earlier. It's been years since you had to go into a museum to see the piece on the wall. I mean, plenty of us feel that that's a different experience than seeing it on a screen in our living rooms. But I think that there still is a lot of growth opportunity there, and an ability to be creative in a different way. I'm thinking of the Zoom play that Nelson wrote and was done at the Public. It wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but to me, it was almost like seeing one of Nelson's pieces at the Public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the level of innovation that
yes.
brings.
That part of it was exciting, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The theater's going to continue to do that. It just is.
I'm curious whether you all, the dynamic of New York being a center that people come to for the arts and live in because of the arts, or remain in because of the arts, whether in the short term we can turn inward and rely on our New York City residents for support for the theater arts, in particular live performance, without perhaps the influx of tourism that has buoyed certainly the commercial theaters for so many years. I'm just curious whether we think that dynamic will lead to more Billie Holiday Theaters, more sort of local, not that what you do is local, but that you draw a local audience as well as a broader audience. I'm curious whether you think that dynamic actually may have some advantages for that audience building that you were both.
Yeah, we do. I do. I think, this came up in the task force, the first meeting we had, and that's that hyperlocal is the future. That this is the moment to encourage audiences to really walk down the block or a couple blocks away and experience theater in their own communities. They don't always have to go to another state, another town. There are incredible theaters across the country. There's incredible art happening across New York City, in every corner of New York City, in all 5 boroughs. And this is a wonderful moment to emphasize the local and the jewels that exist in all of our neighborhoods. It's funny to me that sometimes I have community members who, you know, they'll go to Broadway to see Kenny Leon direct something and pay, my God, the ticket price is what the ticket price needs to be for that economic model to work. But then Kenny Leon directed a play a year ago at the Billie Holiday Theatre, and it's right here in their own neighborhood. And so I would just encourage, and again, this came up in the mayoral task force, that this is a real moment for every institution to really lean in. We've been doing it for 50 years because our roots are very deeply in our community, and we treasure that. But I would encourage every theater to think about that close, you know, neighborhood community as a great asset at this moment.
And it's an educational opportunity as well. How do we, and I'm a big believer in arts education programs, because I think that's how you, as a New Yorker, become a person who loves the arts. It needs to be in your school. You need to learn about it there. There's nothing more local than that, right? And I think that that's going to be a real concentration, as Indira points out, in the next few months, to get New Yorkers to say, oh, yeah, look at this. This is pretty cool. And really buy into it, right?
Well, you bring to mind that I think in many a New Yorker likes the idea of theaters closer at home, because, or off-Broadway theaters, because going into Times Square is a unusual experience that most of us love the theater, but perhaps not the coming and going from. But someone has asked us about the larger venues, and I'm just curious whether either one of you have observations about recovery for, you know, Radio City Music Hall, you know, a less traditional arts venue, and I mean, longstanding historic theater, but more popular, Lincoln Center, places like that, which have very large, you know, rooms that they might draw to.
They have very large rooms and they have very fixed seats. And I think that is going to be a huge part of the problem. I think that, you know, the commercial world is not as well known to me. It's not even very well known to me as the nonprofit world, because I've spent my life in the nonprofit world. But it's just going to be really difficult to figure out how that economic model can work if there isn't a vaccine that allows people to say, you know, I'd be okay if but for that. I have tried not to pay attention to the chat because I don't think I want to know, but there is a moment that you are asking that says, will you go when it reopens? And a lot of people are saying yes, and then the next highest, and it's not very far behind, is not sure yet. And I think there are a lot of people that are simply not sure yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we're not sure yet moment
for the commercial world, which has such a different approach to presenting the art, and in an environment that probably also needs to be looked at.
We need to wrap up, but I wanted to give both of you an opportunity to share any closing comments that you have, or things that you would have liked to touch on that you haven't yet.
I would just want to, well, first, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Kathy, for sharing this time. It's been, you know, again, anytime we can sort of illuminate some of these ideas, I think it's important. I would just say that when I wake each morning since COVID has happened, it's almost seemed surreal. But what I hold fast to is, you know, there's a Catherine Ann Porter, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, who says, the arts live continuously and literally by faith. And then it goes on to talk about when everything else happens, they are what we find again when the ruins are cleared away. And so that is what I hold fast to. I am grateful to be surrounded by such incredible leadership across New York City in the arts and culture field, including Kathy. And, you know, it really is an honor to be in an army of such cultural warriors who are going to ensure that arts and culture, that it comes back better than we've ever been. And I am confident in that.
Thank you for sharing that inspiration.
And that hope that Indira speaks, I think artists share that. They may not act it sometimes, but I think they share it. And I come back to your opening comment, Elizabeth, about healing, because I also think that we're at a moment where we need a great deal of healing. And with people like Indira in the world, with organizations like the Municipal Art Society that organize conversations that can have meaning for people, there's an opportunity for that too. So I'll follow Indira wherever she leads me. And it's been a privilege to spend an hour talking about things that I care that much about, believe that much in, and truly have faith, the faith you're talking about, Indira, to be there for us.
Well, thank you to both of you for your leadership and in joining us this evening, and your inspiring words and your inspiring work, most importantly. We have great confidence that we're being led well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Kath.
Very much. Bye-bye.
Everyone.